The Belgian Grand Prix was set up to be one of the most entertaining races of the season, with the weather throwing in a huge element of unpredictability. In anticipation of this, drivers like Hamilton, Verstappen, Behrman and others set up their car to run with more downforce so that they can make the best of the conditions. And those guys must have woke up, looked out the window, seen the amount of rain and started hitting the doggy. Meanwhile, other drivers like Russell, Leclerc and Ocon decided to run a lower downforce configuration in the event that the conditions would eventually dry out. But that wouldn't be until much later in the race, meaning if the race started on time, we would have a good chunk of the Grand Prix in wet conditions. So those who set up their car to be good in the rain were rubbing their hands together in excitement, only for the FIA to delay the race by an hour and a half until the track was nearly dry to get going. And even when they did, it was behind the safety car for too many laps and a rolling start as opposed to being on the grid with the lights going out. Lewis in particular was critical of this, saying, "We obviously started the race a little too late. I kept shouting it's ready to go." And Max Verstappen had a similar opinion in his interview as well.
They've got going a bit earlier.
Yeah, miles earlier. I mean, 1 hour earlier. It was just, a bit of a shame. Yeah, of course, they took a very cautious approach. Of course, we spoke about it after Silverstone to be a little bit more cautious because there was quite a lot of water there. But this for me was then the other extreme of waiting, and it just ruins a nice classic wet race as well. So we either still try to push to go for a proper wet race, or we just say, you know what, we stop racing in the wet and we just wait for it to be dry.
And seeing how those two are easily among the best drivers in the wet of all time, they know exactly what they're talking about. First, let's address the main reason why the race was delayed in the first place. I've seen a number of people make comparisons to Formula 2 and how they were able to run in the wet without too much interference from the FIA. But those two situations aren't identical. These ground effect cars are known to kick up a lot of spray, so much so that it's basically impossible to see the car ahead. Silverstone is a good example, where Isaac Hadjar ran into the back of Kimi Antonelli. The risk of aquaplaning is also much higher if there's a lot of standing water. So from that perspective, I can understand the level of caution from the FIA, particularly at a track where drivers have had serious crashes, with some being fatal. It's the governing body's responsibility to ensure the safety of the drivers to avoid repeat events like Suzuka 2014 or Spa 2019. And after the British Grand Prix, they did have a discussion with the drivers who were concerned about restarting the race too early due to poor visibility. However, for this weekend in particular, I agree with Max and Lewis. They went too far in the other direction. On the other hand, you've got drivers like Sainz, Leclerc, Piastri and Russell who disagree with this, saying it's better to be safe than have an accident and regret the aftermath. One of the key differences between the Spa and Silverstone cases is the run up through Eau Rouge to Raidillon. Such a steep incline up the hill in treacherous conditions makes it extremely difficult to even see. You're basically driving blind, which is very scary considering how quick that sequence of corners really is. We saw with Norris in 2021 how one small mistake can lead to a serious accident. But for some, namely Lewis and Max, that kind of thing gets them excited. The inherent risk that comes with racing in the wet brings the best out of them, especially given how skilled they are in those conditions. Out of everyone on the grid, I'd say there's nobody that really comes close to those two. They've got the best natural feel, especially in the wet. But then, that's the problem. They're so damn good that you can't really use what they say as a good reference. You've got to remember that like a quarter of the current grid are rookies, with barely any experience in the wet. That's definitely gonna play a factor in making a decision to go ahead with racing or not. Then you've got drivers like Charles and Pierre, who lost a lifelong childhood friend. Those guys will always be in favour of erring on the side of caution, given the traumatic events of 6 years ago. The other point that should be noted is that in Silverstone, the weather was much worse than it was at Spa. Nevertheless, we still got a number of great racing laps. There's also a conversation to be had about Spa just being removed from the calendar entirely. Because if it's too dangerous to race in the wet according to the race director, then why is it considered a grade A circuit? Not to mention, this track has become a bit like Monaco, because it's so hard to overtake in the dry, and everybody's trying to do a one-stop after seeing what George pulled off in 2024. That race proved that track position is everything. And as Piastri said, clean air is king. And so the race got to a point where all the drivers were essentially just managing and nursing the tyres to get to the end, making it a complete snooze fest. At least with the rain, there was an opportunity for things to be shaken up. But since the FIA didn't want to go racing at the start, we only got a few decent laps of proper action. Lewis in particular was looking very quick. Max was also looking good, but only for a short period of time. Red Bull learned from the previous race in Silverstone that running a skinny rear wing in the wet was just a recipe for disaster. So this time around, they learned from their mistakes, and only went with that low downforce setup for the sprint, which allowed Verstappen to breeze past Piastri and hold him off for the win. Then for qualifying, they compromised straight line speed and their position on the grid to have a better setup on Sunday. But since the FIA waited for the rain to clear, they couldn't take advantage, which Max wasn't happy with at all. On the formation lap, when they initially suspended the race, he was of the opinion that they should have just continued behind the safety car for a few laps to clear the water and then gone racing after that. Also, the rain had stopped at that point, and there was a 15-minute window in which they could have had a few laps of racing before the second cell of heavy rain hit the track. And with regards to the poor visibility, he basically just said, between turns 1 and 5, it would only be for a few laps, and the more you run, the better it gets. And if you can't see, you can always lift. I'm not gonna lie, personally, I think he was spitting facts. But who am I to say what they should or shouldn't do? I've never driven a Formula 1 car and probably never will. So if some drivers say they're not comfortable with the conditions, then I can respect that. Problem is though, how is this the pinnacle of motorsport if they're waiting for the conditions to be absolutely perfect before racing? To me, being an F1 driver means not only having incredible speed, but also versatility and adaptability. Those are two skills that are crucial to performing well in the wet. And if some drivers aren't well prepared enough to handle those conditions, then either give them more testing time to actually run in those conditions, or just stay at home and let those who want to race actually race. And I don't want to sound like an old head because that's what I feel like right now, but in previous years, wet races used to take place in extremely treacherous conditions, and drivers would just get on with it. Nowadays though, it just feels like that's not the case anymore, and it won't ever be the same again. From a fan's perspective, it just felt like a potentially exciting race falling flat because the FIA were too scared to run the race in those conditions. But in fairness, can you really blame them? Sectors 1 and 3 at Spa are incredibly high speed and can be dangerous even in dry conditions. In recent years, there have been 2 fatalities, Antoine Hubert in 2019 and Denalo van 't Hoff in 2023. So of course, with those incidents being so fresh in the memory, it makes sense why they would take extra care when making a decision that affects the well-being and lives of the competitors. But I also think there's a balance to be had. You can take the necessary precautions to keep everybody safe, however, you can also do that without taking away the thrilling nature of wet weather races. It just felt like a waste of people's time to watch them do nothing for over an hour when they had the opportunity to run earlier. It just made for a boring race in the end. And one thing that doesn't help is how bad this generation of cars have become. The spray that gets kicked up in the wet is crazy, and the amount that the cars get affected by dirty air in the dry is massive. One tiny bit of floor damage can completely ruin a driver's race. The operating windows are so small, and overall, they're just too damn big. When it comes to the tyres, Pirelli have created a wet weather tyre that essentially never gets used, because they're pretty much unraceable since they displace so much water, as much as 85 litres. That completely destroys visibility and makes it unbelievably difficult to race. And as mentioned previously, there's always a risk of an accident happening through a Rouge and Radeon, which could potentially result in a driver being thrown back onto the racing line and getting T-boned by another car, which is the worst possible outcome. This dilemma is a complex balancing act between the thrill of racing and the absolute need for safety. On one hand, wet conditions are a true test of a driver's skill, courage, and adaptability. They often create the most unpredictable and entertaining races, where driver talent can shine more than just car performance, and where strategy, instinct, and sheer bravery come to the fore. And as a fan, I also love these kinds of races because they break up the monotony of DRS trains and tyre-saving parades. Wet weather races inject life into the sport that at times can feel too optimized and cautious. But at the same time, it's impossible to ignore the legitimate concerns that have been raised by the drivers and addressed by the FIA. As much as I love watching the drivers test their mettle in extreme conditions, it would be foolish to ignore the safety hazards that exist. And while you could argue that drivers sign up for danger, sensible discernment has to be used to determine whether a track is fit for purpose or not. I would rather them not race at all if they believe that it's too risky. Because right now, F1 seems to be stuck between protecting drivers from risk and preserving the DNA of racing, which thrives on drivers pushing the limits in all conditions. And that is not an easy problem to solve. But in my opinion, you can't say this is the pinnacle of motorsport while simultaneously doing everything in your power to avoid racing in the wet. Maybe it's a case of the technology outpacing the conditions. Maybe the cars have become too fast, too big, and too aerodynamically sensitive to operate in heavy rain. The FIA's cautious approach is understandable, given the sport's recent tragedies. But the failure to find a solution to the problem means that classic wet weather races are being erased from the calendar. These are the type of races where heroes are made and where underdogs can shine. And speaking of underdogs, Alex Albon was amazing. P6 and in the mix with some of the frontrunners. Williams have really made some huge steps forward. Shout out to Leclerc as well, holding off Max for P3. He really over-delivered in that Ferrari. Lewis's comeback was also great, Verstappen's sprint drive was perfectly executed, and as for the two McLarens, they were completely dominant. They're going to wrap up the constructors so early this year, it's not even funny. I'm going to release a video probably tomorrow or the day after, talking about this championship battle between Piastri and Norris because I got some things to say. Lawson, Bortoleto and Gasly did really well to score points. The Mercedes guys have some performance to find because it seems that they've gone backwards. Russell managed to get the most out of the car, whereas Antonelli really struggled this weekend. Hopefully, he can bounce back in the next race, but other than that, there's nothing else that happened really. Also, for those who were expecting to see a continuation of the best and worst drivers from every weekend, I apologize. These past few weeks have been quite chaotic, and so I didn't have time to prepare stuff in advance, but if you've made it this far, here's where I'd rank all the drivers for their weekend performance overall. Again, let me repeat, this is for the entire weekend, not just the race. So even though Lewis had an amazing comeback drive, he still made some crucial mistakes in both qualifying sessions. Leclerc and Piastri were both in another league this weekend. Verstappen was amazing too, but that tiny mistake in qualifying is what cost him a podium in the end. Still, the sprint race is why I put him in S. All the drivers in A were brilliant. I debated putting Bortoleto in S since he didn't put a foot wrong. Actually, you know what? Let's give it to him. Everyone in C was just average. Hadjar was cooking in every session apart from the race, where he just fell off. Tsunoda had a really good qualifying, but got screwed over with strategy, so I guess he could have been higher had they got it right. Haas was superb in the sprint, but fell away as the weekend progressed. Aston Martin, I don't even know what's going on with them. And Colapinto and Antonelli just had stinkers, I'm sorry. Hopefully Hungary will be more entertaining, and if there's rain, the FIA will actually let them race. Let me know what your thoughts are about everything that happened this weekend down in the comment section below. Please like, share, and subscribe to the channel if you're new to get my latest videos in the future. And as always, I'll see you in the next one.